Herzlichen Dank für die Einladung. Ich habe mir das Programm angeguckt und habe festgestellt, dass die Hälfte der Vorträge sowieso auf Englisch ist. Und habe hin und her überlegt, rede ich jetzt Englisch oder rede ich Deutsch? Also mir kommt es nicht so furchtbar drauf an. Ich hoffe, es kommt Ihnen auch nicht so sehr drauf an. Das heißt, ich werde diesen Vortrag dann auf Englisch halten. Gordon Childe conceptualized world history in a series of relatively stable stages and fast transitions. Childe identified three such transitions which he called revolutions: a Neolithic, an urban, and an industrial revolution. If archaeologists have argued against Childe's insights, they mostly commented that such changes took too long to be called revolutions. These quarrels do not, however, significantly diminish Childe's insight into fundamental developments in global history. My talk is focused on the urban revolution, which I interpret as a period in which there was a fundamental change, and it is the earliest class conflict that emerged in history, and that class conflict took a violent turn. To build my argument, I will first delve into research history and then sort of find a strange one-sidedness in Mesopotamian archaeology, and then later on I will discuss the material evidence for class conflict. In Near Eastern archaeology, a very influential group of scholars associated with the University of Michigan pursued empirical and conceptual research into Childe's revolutions. However, the transition which Childe had termed the urban revolution was conceptualized as a process whose crucial characteristic was not the appearance of cities, but rather the emergence of states. In anthropological theories, the first emergence of cities turned into an epiphenomenon to a more basic process, namely an increase in sociopolitical complexity, by which Henry Wright and Greg Johnson meant a growing political and economic differentiation of societies. Most Michigan scholars followed a social engineering model, including Ashby's principle of requisite variety, which postulates that mounting differentiation in a horizontal systems dimension, mainly the economy, would automatically entail diversification in the vertical or political dimension and the reverse. More recent studies of urbanization argue for self-amplification of diversity, while others have returned to a focus on associations of inhabitants, ideological characteristics of ancient cities, or factions vying for power. These important changes have been couched in a top-down narrative that silences some of its key aspects. Childe's history, anthropological theories, and more recent theories, such as Guillermo Algaz's growth ideas, all share a distanced structural approach to the urban revolution. The appearance of cities and increased productivity in the hinterland are analyzed as geographical, political, demographic, and cultural phenomena. Antagonisms and impediments to the process are treated mainly as factors that slow down a general trajectory unworthy of investigation in and of themselves. But isn't the complexity of such a basic change of lifestyles only really understood once the multiple and incongruous forces involved in it have been taken into account? When looking back at Childe's writing, we discover a tantalizing one-sidedness in his thinking. He never really investigates how people in the past experienced this transformation. The blind spot in his extremely valuable synthesis is people's positioning towards the historical process they are going through themselves. How could this happen to a Marxist scholar? Didn't Marx insist on the necessity to consider not just class in itself, but for itself, believing that definitive historical change was likely to come about only when a group of people had become aware of their own exploited situation? Or does this principle not apply to pre-capitalist times? One of Childe's references to the interests of subaltern working-class people can be found in Man Makes Himself. And I cite, "The great public works then undertaken employed a host of workers. The latter's status is hard to define. How many labored freely in return for wages or out of sheer piety, or like conscripts in fulfillment of customary obligations to the community, or finally, as slaves, the absolute chattels of an individual, a temple, or a state. All we know for the earliest times is that every laborer who continued to work must somehow be fed and supported by the surplus gathered by primary producers. End of quote. The paragraph reveals that Child was aware of a lacuna in his historiography, namely the social and ideological positions of the subaltern. But instead of insisting on the need to pursue research on this issue, he contented himself with a fleeting acknowledgement of the problem, only to return immediately to the larger structures of surplus gathering and material support. Such a solution of the diverse and likely oppositional views of those who were, for sure, one of the driving forces of urbanization risks shortening and simplifying the complexity of a historical situation. Child's bird's-eye view of history is not the disinterested, knowledgeable outsider's reflection about the past it pretends to be. The difference between etic and emic perspectives, as they are called in general, is mistaken if etic is supposed to be an outsider's and therefore more objective view than an emic one. The reason is very simple, namely that among the many potential insiders and thus insiders' past perspectives, some are closer and others farther away from the etic position in the present. Etic views are, when applied to history and archaeology, always relational. They are not absolutes. They can never refrain from linking up with some and taking distance from other subjects in the past. Child's view parallels that of many others, who in their research and syntheses have reflected on large-scale processes in history. Most such histories, archaeological discourses included, are structured by a specific and firmly established, if you want, relation of relations. At the basis are two relations, one between researcher and research subject, and the other between a narrator and the historical text that is narrated. Researcher and narrator, and this is really important, are not and cannot be identical. The I that is in a text is not you. It is a fictional person that you insert into it. The connection between these two relations is, on a different plane, one of content to form, a connection that is constitutive for present historiography. Historiography imagines these relations in a very restrictive way. The past, as different from the present, the subject of our profession, turns into an object that needs to be mastered. Such mastery is achieved when the past is understood, as we call it, or explained. Historians and archaeologists adopt a narrative form with a uniform standpoint. That is the narrator's problem. This single perspective, usually that of an omniscient narrator, has a deep influence on the content of our accounts of the past. Both relations can be characterized as overpowering, unidirectional, and non-dialectical. The combination of these two relations produces a historiography that is by necessity, I would claim, unrealistic. If we try to capture more fully what happened in a remote past by conceiving of the past as an entity that has coherence, which is what will happen if we take one single point of view, we merge, willingly or not, our own perspective on, as Child says, what happened in history, with the interests of those past people who also had a reason to strive for an overview of socio-political structures. So who are they? In the case of ancient cities and states, these people were the bureaucrats and managers, the priests and early kings, rather than women, workers, or lower-class elderly. Academic discourse develops into an abstract managerial view of the past where society is handled like a business with a balance sheet, and the summary figures tell us how well such a totality is doing. Wright and Johnson, whom I mentioned before, their insightful analysis of decision makers and their space for action takes exactly that kind of a view. The form of our accounts, that is, textual narratives, hides this convergence of past interests and present perspectives. We talk about the past as if it could be captured and represented like the overall features of a large canvas, a world extraneous to our own, and the structure of such narratives with a single outsider viewpoint imposes coherence on what is actually narrated. Now, let's look for a different possibility here. In contrast, Alexander Kluge's monumental attempt to render a fictional impression of the Battle of Stalingrad, namely with its title Schlachtbeschreibung, or Walter Kempowski's documentary on the end of World War II, Das Echolot, are convincing attempts, as far as I'm concerned, to integrate multiple perspectives. They do not leave a shred of coherence to their theme of research. And in the event, though their topics are turned into unmanageable and therefore unmastered narrations that give a much deeper sense of the complexity and contradictory character of historical reality than the more successful, coherent historical works that are edifying because they are kind of abridged summaries. So this double relational arrangement I just talked about of omniscient perspective and objectification is at the root of a further spin, namely cross-cultural anthropological comparison. Cases in point are Robert McAdams' The Evolution of Urban Society. You can take Michael Mann's The Sources of Power, or Tim Earle's How Chiefs Come to Power. Historians or archaeologists' search for past reality should not include dry facts plus an account of structural institutional changes, but also considerations of people's involvements in those changes. Those archaeologists who adopt or who try to do that, they basically very often adopt agency theories and want to tackle this problem in this way. Now, this is not so easy, just give me 5 minutes to explain that. Namely, we find two different ways of doing this. These are radically different. One we can call an entrepreneurial model, and the other, for lack of a better term, a practicalist one. Kent Flannery, also from Michigan, and others turn agency largely into the potential for action by individual entrepreneurs among emerging elites. In such scenarios, agents are mostly individuals whose motivation is derived from an assumption of instrumental rationality. Their actions are supposed to optimize specific returns for themselves or for their group. Because of this specific reductionist set of assumptions, the agency of such individuals lends itself to simulations and, in some form, agent-based modeling. There is a lot of research going on, for example, in Santa Fe on this kind of on the basis of this way of thought. This approach does not solve the above-mentioned historiographical problems, since the underlying essence of humanity, if you want, of such approaches is the capacity for optimizing means-ends relations. The past is then turned into a project of modernity. Over-idealized Cartesian subjects populate a virtual world that is supposed to reflect the past. The importance of such constructions is not so much whether or not they serve to enlighten us about the past, but rather the ideological mechanism, I would claim, of dehistoricizing our present instrumental rationality as a timeless and ubiquitous feature of being human. 20th century history has revealed the dangers of such a worldview and its projections. A completely different kind of practice-based concept of agency is driven by the sociological theories of Pierre Bourdieu and Anthony Giddens. In these concepts, agency is a potential for action by anyone, not just the powerful. And in most archaeological applications of this approach, a vague notion of small group agency prevails. This conceptual perspective asks questions at the scale of daily life. Such thinking has to deal with the complex problem of motivations and their status in human practices. But this approach has its own drawbacks. Applications in archaeological contexts posit that daily life consisted of practices that are barely ever reaching the level of discursivity. A favored way of explaining long-term change turns small and large-scale transformations into unintended consequences of embodied practices, rather than moves in favor of or opposition to specific historical conditions. So you take the agency out of the people you are talking about. Thus, agency theories have advocated world histories that are either a product of competing avant-garde-like entities, or they are the result of some sort of a Hegelian Weltgeist that reveals itself only after the fact to the insightful historian archaeologist. These approaches have deep political and ethical repercussions. Complexity modeling as a way of investigating past worlds has increasing numbers of adherents in archaeology. You can feel that actually in Topoi, and many in the wider field of well-funded natural sciences. The sociological practicalist approach once dominated scholarly debates within archaeology, but as far as I perceive it anyway, seems to be receding at present. Both of them treat past events and people in an undialectical fashion, ignoring the peril that the academic creation of alterities can work back in fatal ways on our own world. And both of these approaches neglect the fundamentally antagonistic nature of history. Can we really assume that Neolithic revolutions and urbanization processes went unchallenged? Isn't it clear from the description of the emergent diversification of society and divisions of labor that those who had to lose in the process were not obliging blindly? Neither Child nor most later authors investigate these problems in great detail. Rather, narratives focus on specialization as a manifestation of what I explained to you as horizontal differentiation of a system, an index of social complexity. The assumed desirability of progress is palpable in such writings. Should we not consider the repercussions of such narratives on our own present condition? Back to the deep past. I contend that we should expect a reaction from those whose social and economic position deteriorated in the process of co-optation, even when such change took hundreds of years. The assumption that people were unaware of the process, leading to a tendency towards explications of change as I said, unintended consequence, is myopic. Antagonisms, whether a staunch resistance, discourse, or both, were always part of history. I mention an example to which Child himself referred: human mobility. Part of the romanticized past is the image of the eternal unchanging village or city, a sedentary-centrist image that divides the world sharply into peasant and urban settled populations versus mobile sectors of nomads, traders, and itinerant craftspeople. Human societies were always, to a lesser or larger extent, mobile, with complex forms of deliberate or forced movements. The fundamental consequences of various forms of travel and mobility are located in the social and intellectual realm. People became cognizant of others' lifestyles and were capable of comparing those with their own. Life outside of cities and states was not unknown to urban dwellers. Whether through traveling, craftsmen, herders, exogamy, or other means, mobility was a way to verbally and/or materially spread knowledge of other ways of life. And this kind of knowledge served as a backdrop to one's own conditions, as a tool for self-reflection by a group or individual. One indication of this is that all societies with writing have produced narratives of their others. It is usually assumed that such alterities are by necessity depicted in a demeaning fashion, that is, the other is evil, as in the Odyssey or in tales of Gilgamesh and Humbaba. But this is likely just a characteristic of officially propagated stories. A good example of unofficial stories are here Pashtun tales collected by Aisham Ahmad. Many of these provide a counter-image to the stark and real power differences between genders in Pashtun society. In almost all of these stories, courtly women come across as smart and alert, whereas the majority of male power holders and throne pretenders are foolish figures. These narratives synthesize what James Scott calls hidden transcripts. Counterworlds do not spring up from nowhere. They are based on real encounters with another, even when the specific stories, such as Wilhelm Tell or others, have no historical kernel. A silencing of the, A silencing of the obstinate or actively resisting forces in history has often been noted, but is at best hinted at in academic accounts of the ancient Near East. One of Child's mistakes was his teleological view of history, based firmly in an attempt to trace back the processes that led from prehistoric villagers to the present in a fairly uniform development. Despite his Marxist stance, or maybe in part because of that, he succumbed to a longer-term history conceptualized as I said, unilinear and upwards trajectory. More benevolent interpretations suggest that maybe his pacifist convictions led him to silence conflict, class conflict or warfare, as a motor of change. Anthropological theories do not fare better, as they also disavow the multiplicity of voices of those in conflict with each other. Discourses about ancient Mesopotamia that speak of prosperity or of civilization are so deeply ingrained in the academic discipline that their dissolution, to dissolve this, is almost impossible. So could call them, with Foucault, sort of regimes of truth. Such coherence in historical representations is fundamentally mistaken, as it neglects the internal dialectics and contradictory developments that are at the base of all human activities. However, not all perspectives in the past can be construed as equal either. The power holder's interest is that of conserving a system, having at hand a considerable knowledge of ongoing processes, to which I'm going to come back in a moment, and on the other hand, or rather, they take as helpers those that Antonio Gramsci termed organic intellectuals. People who help conceptualize worldviews that depict particular interests of the dominant class as general ones. It is the subaltern, often destitute groups who privilege insight into social conditions as their interests in any maintenance of a status quo, and that are minimal at best. History is likely replete with situations where peasants, workers, women, and other subjected sectors of a society try to overturn ruling conditions. Archaeologists have not bothered to investigate these closely, assuming that the sources would simply not allow us to do so. Historical narratives reveal the ways in which we side with the interests of the powerful. A breathtaking example comes from Child himself, as the quote reveals here. Finally, war helped in a great discovery, that men as well as animals can be domesticated. Instead of killing a defeated enemy, he might be enslaved. How can such a sentence form part of an emancipatory history? This is only possible because an academic community finds no offense in taking the perspective of the slaveholder and potential killer, i.e. the person for whom the availability of slaves is great. A change from perspectival, single standpoint narratives to the creation of multi-perspectival accounts that juxtapose views of different people, whether servants, workers, or the upper class, would result in completely different histories. Urbanization, state emergence, and tragedies of the commoners, as they are called, as historical subjects are always and utterly incomplete unless the views of social forces that tried to overcome such processes and their outcomes are included. Our harmonious theories of Mesopotamian city development can be said to be kind of romantic beautifications of a much harsher, antagonistic, and discordant historical reality, one that in most cases remains to be discovered. So now I turn to fourth millennium Mesopotamia to show this potential for a different history. I argue that we need to frame this crucial economic transition differently, namely as the advent of sharp conflicts of interest. Mesopotamia is of relevance for any discussion of the first tendencies towards class division. First signs for the growth of settlements and social differentiation date to the preceding Ubaid period and of the earlier 5th millennium, but it is the later 5th to 4th millennia on which I focus here. The period is variously called the Uruk or late Chalcolithic period. The Mesopotamian case is crucial because it has served as a model for urbanization for many other regions in the world. The Uruk period in southern Mesopotamia is characterized by a massive rural-urban migration. You can see that when you look at the two slides, the left and the right side, leading to a growth of a very few cities, the largest among them Uruk. Traditionally, studies of settlement systems in the lower alluvium of the Euphrates and Tigris divide the area into a northern Nippur Adab region in red and the southern region around the city of Uruk. Beyond that presumed cultural social double core of the Uruk tradition, remains of the same style of material culture were found in lowland and highland Iran to the east and northeast, in the steppes of northern Mesopotamia, as well as in what is today southeastern Turkey. The relations between the southern Mesopotamian population in the alluvium and the outlier regions are not entirely clear up to today, despite a lot of research, and interpretations range from models of world systems, colonization, trade networks, to even refugee settlements. Uruk, the city of Uruk, by far the largest agglomeration, had an extensive temple platform and a complex of huge non-domestic buildings in the center of the settlement. Their functions remain obscure, as some had apparently been cleaned out before abandonment, and excavators did not document closely the find spots of objects. Materials for this public architecture were durable and sort of much more durable than the usual used small mud brick called Riemchen. One of the tripartite temples even was built entirely out of limestone, which had to be transported from nearby, as they say. And Rainer Michael Böhmer says, only some 50 kilometers to the southwest. On the surface, you see the temple, it's the LT up there. On the surface, that may be an innocuous descriptive statement. But wouldn't the word only disappear immediately had real-world experience of workers intruded into such writing? I will return to this issue below. Suffice it to say here that this limestone building was a unique occurrence in ancient southern Mesopotamia. Neighboring structures had embellished facades of hard-fired clay cones with coloring on one end. Set into a bed of plaster, they protected a mud brick core of the walls from wind and weather. These structures of unusual durability were at the same time of extraordinary splendor, locations of political power at the center of a fast-growing city. The technique of using clay cones was emulated in smaller towns. You can see that up there with this places marked with a C, where they have been found on the surface of contemporary sites. Monumentality, as displayed here, always has both temporal and spatial dimensions, which are present in Uruk period architecture as sheer size and new kinds of durable materials. City plans from southern Mesopotamia are basically unknown. However, some northern Mesopotamian places in Syria, such as Habuba Kebira, not only had thoroughfares and so-called Mittelsaalhäuser with a relatively standardized plan, but also major public buildings with typical temple plans. Now, who was living and working in villages, towns, and cities? Despite a lot of field research, this is still difficult to answer. Susan Pollock argues on empirical grounds that the Nippur Adab region in the northern part of Babylonia is not urbanized in the Uruk period, since it is dotted with what she calls agricultural towns, settlements where activities are largely identical to those of smaller villages, and where vast public structures are, at least so far, not identifiable. If Pollock's thesis is correct, it would be important to know what living structures in those towns looked like. Unfortunately, evidence for the region is nearly non-existent. Reliance on evidence from peripheral cities, such as Habouba Kebira in Syria, risks falling prey to exceptional situations. Habouba Kebira is a town that lacks any history of slow growth, but was set up all at once. Insofar, you might say it resembles Le Corbusier's Chandigarh, one of the richest cities in present-day India. According to Marlies Heinz, the Habouba Kebira houses can be grouped into 5 different classes by size, and class 2 is the type that would indicate living structures of an elite. However, the less conspicuous structures in Heinz's typology are not that much smaller and are interspersed among the larger ones. In other words, the architectural documentation doesn't really allow us to make any inferences about a split between socioeconomic classes in terms of living conditions. It would seem unlikely, however, that the massive public structures of a city like Uruk were built by inhabitants of these large Mittelsaalhäuser, such as those found here at Habouba Kebira. So we need to look for other evidence. The time of urbanization coincides with the first use of stone on a massive scale for large-scale imagery, or what you could call monumental art. As in architecture, durability of matter and object size are deployed in novel ways in this Uruk period. I suggest that a temporal surplus, meaning the relation between the object and one's own life, of the material world, when compared to earlier times, produces a stark reversal of the relation between people and their surroundings. Uruk period material culture produces a new paradoxical relation between people and objects. The material conditions into which people are thrown appear in part to be hyperstable, beyond the lives of the individual and over several generations, and in part, however, artificially shortened. Namely, so when we look at this contrast, disposal patterns of so-called bevel rim bowls, a crude type of pottery, imply a strong counter-trend, a realm of society where throwaway practices reach almost postmodern dimensions. Anywhere you dig, you find bevel rim bowls, and not just the sherds of them, but complete ones. How could such sharply divergent tendencies co-occur? Traditionally, this question has been silenced, as art historians have focused on the aesthetic desires for an explanation of the changes in artistic and representational phenomena, while forgetting completely the accompanying crude items of daily life. Those archaeologists who are interested in the coarse bowls, I come back to that, however, have political systems rather than the users in mind. Employing this new material requires the development of technical skills, relations of production, and tools. In this time period, bow drills and micro borers were likely used to a much greater extent than before. There is evidence for their use in the production of seals and stone bowls, so you use hollowing with these pump borers. Not only were new skills and tools necessary, but also fresh paths to acquire the necessary raw materials. The social status of stonecutters is unknown to us, as well as the organization of their work. But one category of their products, the cylinder seals, clearly shows a split into 2 vastly different groups. There are high-quality seals, which you see on the left, that have a large circumference and thus also a large surface for pictorial representation. They are worked with a number of different tools, from drills to engravers, and their subjects are mostly derived from the political-religious realm. Another class of seals is smaller, made in a much more expedient way with bow drills and short, straight engraved cuts, and the scenes depicted, if at all interpretable, often contain women as textile workers. They have these pigtail heads. The production of such a clearly structured representational set was probably due to a guided effort by an elite to construct a worldview that was both segregating and inclusive. Was this then the outcome of the cunning reason of rulers and priests, you could ask? We cannot decide this with the evidence at hand. However, the ability to convince artisans to develop new technologies in order to produce images of the powerful and the subaltern in such sharply divided media was not necessarily seen by all concerned in a positive light, I would argue. A unified reaction by artisans would be an equally unlikely scenario. Eigensinn of artisans in the Uruk period has not been researched. Mostly because archaeologists have not developed methods to ask such questions, but also because we have been fascinated by the sudden emergence of artifacts that the modern world considers still as aesthetically pleasing art. If research questions are ideologically driven, potential research questions that are not asked tell us even more about our own archaeological blinkers, ideological blinkers. One of the major representational achievements is the depiction of people in relation to each other. So in earlier periods, people are overwhelmingly shown individually in figures or on stamp seals in relation to animals. The pre-urban depictions almost never include unequal relations between people. The sudden change to an emphasis on the depiction of hierarchies must be seen as reflecting dramatic social change and economic change, even if the symbolic realm conceals rather than unveils real social relations. The representation of unequal relations was likely a way to uphold a political hierarchy. A precondition is a specific framing that naturalizes this kind of relations. Imagery on cylinder seals, stelae, and the first statues often shows a figure that is rendered in a standardized fashion, easily recognizable as a ruler among his folk for his greater height, extravagant hairdo, long beard, and long skirt, often with elaborate decoration. So the figure is called the man in net skirt. In contrast, most other men are depicted naked. Women never appear on the same image as this ruling figure, with one exception. The ideological implications are by far not fully understood. So here is the exception. Submission to this man im Netzrock is legitimized by imagery that shows him in association with the symbol of the goddess Inanna, which is on the uppermost row here, these two, how would you describe them, these Schilfringbündel, they are called in German, behind the figure opposite the break. The most striking such depiction is on this so-called Uruk vase, or vase, where superimposed registers display from bottom up water, plants, a row of rams, naked men carrying baskets, and finally the uppermost row, the ruler and two attendants in the scene where they encounter this woman, most likely a priestess of the goddess Inanna or the goddess herself. We don't know. The stone vase justifies the principles of inequality in several ways. First, even nature knows hierarchies, namely animals, plants, and water are kind of set amongst, below each other. Second, the ruler among humans is himself subservient to a supernatural power, the goddess Inanna or her priestess. And third, the vase itself provides a strong threat of exclusion by omitting half of humanity, namely women. Instead, women are mostly depicted on small and coarsely made cylinder seals as groups of servile workers who pursue monotonously uniform activities such as weaving and spinning. On some occasions, overseers can be identified. Thus, the visual framing of submissive humans achieved through an inclusion of the animal and plant world is at the same time exclusive. The vase and other durable visualizations of a starkly hierarchical world do not simply represent the world in which they were made. They create this world through eliminatory imagery. Women are simply not allowed into the same imagery as the ruler. It may therefore not be astonishing that such a representational universe incorporates the appearance of normative depictions of violence, shackling, and killing. Traditionally, so this is the first time that we see any violence depicted in any Mesopotamian period. Traditionally, they have been interpreted as scenes of war. called Gefangenenszene in the literature, the exact content of the depictions is not entirely clear. However, the caption of a representation where naked men use sticks and similar objects to savagely beat up others who are bound together in a crouching position is a framing that steers what we see. Take Robert Englund's caption as an alternative, prisoners being tortured. That makes us, I would contend, see a different image. Among the seal images with prisoners from Uruk are two that are particularly often displayed. Both include a tall man with a spear overseeing a torture scene. Interestingly, archaeologists and art historians have spilled a lot of ink over who that figure is, and who have mostly concluded that it is this man im Netzrock, a figure in later texts called En. However, who are the tortured and the torturers? Another unasked question, revealing in the light of our history. In all cases of such scenes from Uruk, listed for example by Böhmer, torturers and victims are distinguished solely by their bodily comportment, not by any hairdo or anything else, clothing, whatever it may be. Judging by the photos and drawings, they are all naked. It is therefore not entirely clear that this is a scene of war that is an external conflict rather than repressive forces of an emerging state against its own population. The excavation of a grisly local mass grave site at Tel Majnouna, recently near Tel Brak, reconfirms this suspicion. Indeed, a clear political and conceptual separation between external and interior populations in the Uruk period is another unquestioned preconception that impinges on the interpretation of the imagery and the period as a whole. And I must say that the preliminary analysis of the skeletons seems to suggest that these people were local. The brutal scenes are clearly a crucial moment in a sequence of events. A clash of some sorts must have happened before. And what happened after? Were the tortured people freed, imprisoned, or killed? On a seal from Susa, a figure similar to the one overseeing torture in the Uruk sealings is shooting with a bow at people who are already pierced by arrows in front of a structure that is most likely a temple. The ruler is likely a metonym for a larger fighting entity. But the space in which this fight against naked adversaries takes place is a city, making the depiction of an internal conflict more likely than a war against outside enemies. As for the aftermath of torture, we may have to go back to Child's comment on the great discovery of slavery. In a discussion of the earliest texts that belong into this period, Robert Englund notes the structural similarity between texts that deal with herds of animals and herds of people. He interprets this as an indication for slavery. The phenomenon of herding humans seems to have been fairly widespread. The depiction of animals at work in many seals from Susa, so they are like donkeys doing work, fall into the same category. This theme is extremely important as the benevolent protection by a herder, a sort of pastoral governmentality, avant la lettre, and the repressive function of commanding people in work groups appear at the same time. While the first writing appears in Mesopotamia in this late Uruk period, the scribes restricted themselves largely to lists and accounting. Even the deeds of rulers are not mentioned, and we have to wait until the mid-3rd millennium, so several hundred years, to find reliable accounts of historical persons and their names. However, a list of professions attests that activities were internally and hierarchically divided. In some places, a sign is used that in later centuries takes on the meaning of overseer. From the pictorial combined with written evidence, we can safely conclude that Uruk society was class-based with sharp gender inequalities. However, texts only hint at the evidence of lower-class people in the late Uruk period. They do not tell us anything about the lives of these people. Available architecture, as I said, and city plans are of no help either. However, I mentioned also already these widely spread objects, the beveled rim bowls, that reveal aspects of subaltern living and working conditions. These bowls received a lot of attention because of their ubiquity. They are everywhere. I mean, you find that just, there are 90 to 95% of pottery assemblages. But again, some important questions about them have rarely been asked. Beveled rim bowls were made of very coarse clay. The bowls have impressions of fists on the inside, a grainy exterior, and a roughly smoothed exterior rim. In contrast to other, partly or mostly wheel-turned vessels of the time, these bowls were entirely hand-shaped. They were pressed into a mold in the ground, the edge cut off obliquely, and then the interior coarsely smoothed. Speed was likely the key aspect of the production process. The bowls have been found literally in tens of thousands and at almost every site of the Uruk period. What is more astounding is that many of them were complete. Hans Nissen first proposed a long time ago to interpret them as ration bowls, based on their sizes, which fit contemporary textual indications of personal daily food rations. At this early stage, archaic writing uses a sign called gar that closely resembles a bowl, and the archaic sign gu 7 shows a head holding such a vessel to the lips. Nissen's proposal has opened the door to many ideas about the organization of work and payment, political economy, and distributional mechanisms. Beveled rim bowl densities have been interpreted as indicators of the intensity of dependent work and its payment. Henry White has suggested in a particularly convincing case that the variable densities of these bowls in a deep pit from the site of Sharafabad were due to seasonal and annual variations of productive activities. All these reconstructions have provided many insights into the functioning of Uruk society in the fourth millennium. Nevertheless, I claim that these interpretations are curiously lopsided. They rightly presuppose a public sector economy where a lower class of dependent workers were paid, that is, fed by their, if you want, employers. Archaeologists have investigated at length questions of management and bureaucracy of payment and allocation of work. Willingly or not, in asking these questions, researchers have consistently taken the standpoint of past powers that be. They have adopted the perspective of those who distributed food rather than those who received and consumed it. If one sticks entirely to texts, the evidence can hardly avoid adoption of the stance of administrators and managers. That is kind of clear. Mesopotamic cuneiform writing was developed for exactly those tasks. However, we, I myself included as archaeologists, we do not need to reflect on who determined how to use scarce means in order to maximize specific ends. We have direct access to quotidian objects of work and reproduction. And still, the focus is on managerial decision-making rather than exploring how the exploited reacted to such decisions. Alan Zagarel's approach is one exception to the trend, but he focuses on periods later than what we are talking about here. The views of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people who were forced to use those ugly bowls in their daily lives have been entirely silenced. This is really, if I would say, this is bizarre. An oversight in a field of research such as archaeology that goes back decades and that was and is expressly concerned with the common people. So what can these bowls tell us about working class perspectives in ancient Mesopotamia? What were the circumstances of life that forced people to eat from these coarse containers? Early texts will not provide us with an answer, as said, nor will pictorial representations, as the bowls in question are not really occurring on imagery. Since few, if any, living quarters of the working class are known, the only access to the perspective of the subaltern is from some primary contexts where bowls may have been set up for use and others where they were dumped. There are very few instances where beveled rim bowls were found in primary contexts And when they were found in that context, they were almost always found turned upside down, as here at Chogamish in southwestern Iran. And in rows, bowl numbers and also texts suggest that distributions of rations occurred on a massive scale. We do not know for a fact what kinds of foodstuffs were distributed, as successful residue analysis for such vessels are, to my knowledge, unavailable. However, judging by the sign Gu7, easily interpretable as a head holding one of these bowls to the lips, at least when you turn it 90 degrees, it must have been something that could be drunk, a kind of maybe a porridge. And the smoothed edge of the bowl reconfirms that the gesture of the sign Gu7 has indeed a real background. And texts suggest that the liquid consumed might have been some sort of a barley product, most likely a kind of a beer, which was, however, not as thin as what we drink, but rather a kind of a sticky alcoholic pulp. So, where did people consume these foodstuffs? In one case, at least, the bowls were found under a house floor, most likely after being discarded by construction workers. In other cases, gangs of workers may have been sent out to clean canals, at least texts roughly indicate that, an immensely important task that needed to be done at least yearly. Using the evidence from the beveled rim bowls arranged in neat rows at Chogamish, we can imagine a scene where workers gather for a break during work to pick up centrally distributed food, like in a mensa. In most situations, such a place would have been in the open fields or near canals, more often than not away from towns. The beer-like ration was at the same time liquid, necessary in a hot and dry climate, and nutritious in addition. Apparently, the production of these bowls was so cheap that they were often thrown away in unbroken complete state. The expediency of the production process suggests that these items were made at or near the place of their use. Transport costs of the bowls were higher than the shifting of potters around with the work gangs who used them, conveniently also obliterating any temporal surplus of lower class materiality, so they couldn't keep things. If we take the potter to bowl relationship as an indicator of general relations between worker and product, these finds indicate an early case of utter alienation in production. Ecologically, we have to imagine a countryside where fuel gathering in large quantities from locally available plants was still possible, a very different situation from today's southern Iraq. There is an interesting split between the majority of pottery shapes that were made with the help of the wheel, indicating specialized production, and the hasty and careless making of these bowls. It might suggest that the people for whom they were destined had to make them as well. They were already at the point of materially producing the means of their own submission, which, ironically, are at the same time means for their own survival. So to sum up, by Uruk times, conditions of work had changed from household-based communities and respective forms of commensality, eating together, to one where dependent workers were fed away from home in a public sphere. Daily food consumption was dislocated from kin-based contexts within houses in the earlier Ubaid period to the public sphere in the Uruk period. This change had several fundamental consequences. Traditional commensality was broken up. Consuming food together in a work setting instead of a household led to the formation of a relationship, if you want, of collegiality and new collective subjects that maybe one would call them in German Kumpels, that didn't exist before. Eating or drinking together is one of the most important loci for the constitution of social relations. Communication in commensal contexts is mostly non-functional chatting. The new process, an emergent form of producing subjects, is likely to have contributed substantially to the erosion of older types of subjectivities, such as those based on kin relations, which were formed and reproduced in households. These new subjectivities, shaped in specific commensal situations, eating situations, also allow us a glimpse into an area we as archaeologists rarely explore, namely verbal communication. It is likely that with public commensality, work gangs eating, new sociolects emerged based on the task-oriented communication needs of work gangs rather than those of households. Likely, words and linguistic idiosyncrasies appeared that were specific to the working class. They are not, obviously, they are not preserved in writing because they were not of interest to the scribes and bureaucrats. According to texts, rations were paid on a monthly basis. However, the volume of the bevel rim bowls rather suggests a daily payment. Either way, payment in kind must have allowed workers to form an abstract notion of labor. We know from different kinds of work that were paid in this way, from agriculture to weaving. All of the products were quantified by production within a time unit, and they used the bowl symbol gar that could be to denote these time units. The result of work was calculated by bureaucrats in abstract terms of ration equivalence. This concept of alienated labor cannot have remained hidden from workers either, although we do not know exactly how they perceived the relations between themselves, the object and time of work, and their employers. The vast quantity of bevel rim bowls disposed in a completely usable state seems to be wasteful production. We can only suppose that the overseers were concerned about cheating in the process of food distribution to explain that phenomenon. At least I have no other idea. Thus, the distributed food must have been more expensive than the mass production of the bowls themselves, which were apparently of such a low value that no particular care was taken to collect them after use. More important was that no one should receive maybe 2 rations. Therefore, the beer-like food was likely already filled into counted bowls upon distribution, and this would explain why there were these neat rows at the site of Jogamish. This implies that individuals were eating collectively, but at the same time, each person's individuality was enhanced by receiving their own bowl. In addition, the amount of food distributed was severely limited. I assume that this process of public and collective commensality at work, combined with an individualization of consumption and scarcity in food, that was hunger, led to both protectiveness of one's food, an egoistic attitude, and external solidarity, namely that all work and are paid equally. So, 4th millennium worker subjectivities, I would claim, were likely inherently contradictory. Class solidarity, however, seems to have been more important than internal jealousies over amounts of food. As I already said, the first depiction of violent conflict stems exactly from this period. The image of a ruler and his followers beating and handcuffing others has been traditionally interpreted as war, meaning a fight between 2 different political systems. However, outward similarities between followers and the enemies suggest a scene of internal insurrection, or the first depiction of violent class conflict. As noted at the beginning of this paper, we need to pay more attention to the possibilities of revolt and resistance, and become more creative in finding ways to detect such events. The historical transformation of the occasional beer party, like probably that's how this started, plus work in the late 5th millennium, to the hiring of to the tiring daily drudgery in public work projects, took several hundred years to develop. While no one, not even elites, foresaw all these changes when they started to develop, they created radically new collective subjectivities. This process was not driven by any concrete intentions, a point made by Child rather implicitly but consistently. Child's identification of a major economic transition in the time of urbanization remains valid and will drive further archaeological research. However, we need to open new perspectives into the investigation of this so-called revolution, as such processes were multifaceted and contested. The most important of these perspectives is that of people who suffered through the changes. Today's dominant narratives of social evolution, but also many Marxist historian theories, are too optimistic in their teleological idea that humanity had to go through certain stages in order to arrive at where we are today. The victims on this long and winding path through history were all too quickly dismissed as a necessity to reach the final golden age. Our own histories help promote these necessary victims of political systems in which we live. A first step to change this is the renunciation of framing terminologies such as urban revolution and state emergence. The process might better be termed the genealogy of enslavement and economically driven alienation. And a fresh look at these processes from the perspective of the losers will lead to a much more detailed and realistic historical account that includes the dialectics of historical change and the emergence of subaltern and oppressed collective subjectivities. Thank you.